Cuba, 1843. Under the burning sun of the Triunvirato plantation, a young African woman grips a machete with trembling hands and blazing eyes. That night, Carlota Lukumi would cut through more than chains. She would carve freedom into the soul of her people. In the mid-19th century, Cuba glittered like the jewel of the Spanish Empire. From the bustling ports of Havana to the endless fields of Matanzas, the island's heartbeat pulsed with sugar. White gold, they called it the sweet poison that filled Europe's teacups and the empire's coffers. But behind every crystal of sugar was a drop of blood. More than 400,000 African men and women were dragged across the Atlantic to work the plantations. Shackled, branded, and broken, they cut cane from dawn until their backs bled and their lungs filled with ash. The humid air carried the smell of burnt molasses, and sweat, the scent of suffering, turned into profit. The planters grew rich. Havana's mansions sparkled with chandeliers shipped from Spain, while the people who made that wealth possible slept in huts of mud and straw. Each night, the crack of the whip echoed like thunder over the cane fields, and in that thunder, sometimes, a prayer would hide a prayer whispered in Yoruba, the language of stolen ancestors. Among those voices was a young woman named Carlota, from the Lukumi people of West Africa. Her name, given by her captors, replaced the one her mother had whispered at birth. But within her heart, something refused to die. She carried with her the rhythm of the drums, the taste of home, and the memory of freedom. On the Triunvirato plantation, she worked beneath overseers who called her animal, who measured her life in sugarcane cut and wounds received. She was beaten, chained, and mocked. But every lash carved her resolve deeper, like fire burning iron into steel. Carlota did not cry. She watched. She waited. The island of sugar and blood was about to ignite, and the flame would start with her. Carlota was born somewhere in the land once called Yoruba, in what is now Nigeria. Before she was taken, she might have danced in the dust to the sound of drums, heard her elders speak the names of gods like Ogun and Yemoja, protectors of strength and the sea. But those memories faded when the slavers came. The night they raided her village, she was still a child. She was marched to the coast with chains cutting her wrists, her family gone, her world collapsing into the endless blue of the Atlantic. The slave ship was a coffin with sails, hundreds packed below deck, the air thick with death and salt. When Cuba appeared on the horizon, it wasn't salvation, it was another form of hell. She could not read or write. She could not speak Spanish, but she remembered the songs of her people, songs that spoke of defiance. On the Triunvirato plantation, she hummed them quietly while swinging her machete through the cane. Each note was rebellion disguised as rhythm. The overseers laughed when they saw her strength. They didn't know that the Lukumi never kneel. They didn't know that every scar on her back was a vow. She learned to understand their language, to study their routines, to feel the pulse of fear that ran beneath their arrogance. Each night, under the Caribbean moon, she whispered to herself, "They may own my body, but not my soul." What she didn't know yet was that the soul she guarded so fiercely would soon awaken thousands more. By 1843, whispers of rebellion floated through the sugar fields of Matanzas like smoke from a distant fire. The slaves, or rather, the enslaved Africans who still remembered freedom, were speaking quietly, secretly, in the spaces between the lashes of the whip. The rumors said, "Something is coming." Carlota was among those who carried that whisper. On the Triunvirato plantation, she found an ally, another African woman named Fermina, whose eyes burned with the same fierce refusal to bow. They worked side by side beneath the sun, silent by day. But when night fell, the air came alive with code. Messages passed through rhythm, through the beat of drums, through chants sung low enough to sound like prayer. In Cuba, drums were forbidden to the enslaved, for the masters knew what the rhythm could do. They feared it, the language of rebellion hidden in music. Fermina and Carlota used it anyway. A beat meant gather. A pause meant wait. A change in tone meant it begins soon. And when someone asked, "What are we waiting for?" Carlota answered softly, "For the night when fear dies." They met in secret, in the shacks and by the fires, using songs to spread the plan. The uprising would start in November. The targets, Triunvirato, Arcana, and Concepcion, 3 neighboring plantations, chained by the same cruelty. Each night, more joined. Men with scars like maps across their backs, women who had buried their children in cane fields. They had no guns, no training, no armor. But they had machetes, the same tools that once cut sugarcane would now cut the chains. Freedom, in Cuba, began not with a scream, but with a whisper that refused to fade. November 5th, 1843. The moon hung low over the sugarcane fields, a pale witness to what was about to unfold. Carlota gripped her machete. Around her stood men and women with torches, faces streaked with ash, eyes glinting with something sharper than steel. Desperation turned into courage. When she raised her arm, the drums answered, the rhythm of war, the rhythm of the Lukumi gods. The sound rolled through the fields like thunder over dry leaves, then silence. For one heartbeat, the island held its breath, and then chaos. They stormed the overseer's house first. Carlota swung her machete, the same tool she had used every day for years, but this time, it was not for sugar. It was for justice. The walls burned, the cages shattered, and the enslaved ran free into the night. From Triunvirato, the fire spread to Arcana and Concepcion. The revolt grew with every mile, with every drumbeat. The plantations that had once smelled of sugar now smelled of smoke. Carlota led from the front, her clothes torn, her hands bleeding, her voice carrying above the flames. Ogun fights with us tonight. For hours, the island trembled under the sound of trampled earth and breaking chains. Hundreds were freed. In that single night, Carlota Lukumi did what centuries of empire had failed to imagine. She made the enslaved remember that they were never truly conquered. The uprising at Triunvirato did not remain contained. Within days, flames of rebellion leapt from one plantation to the next, like sparks on dry cane. The smoke could be seen for miles, black pillars against the golden sky of Matanzas. To the Spanish masters, it was terror. To the enslaved, it was the sunrise of freedom. Carlota's name became a whisper carried by the wind. The woman with the machete, they said. The one who speaks to the drums. Across neighboring estates, hundreds left their chains and joined her cause. Men who had known nothing but the taste of dust now lifted their heads. Women who had been silent for years began to sing the old Yoruba songs again. The Spanish overseers panicked. In Havana, news of the rebellion arrived with blood-stained letters, urgent reports demanding reinforcements. Soldiers were dispatched by the hundreds, their boots heavy with fear. The colonial authorities could not comprehend how this had begun, not with generals, not with written plans, but with a woman. Carlota refused to retreat. She led her people into the forests near the plantations, moving under cover of night, her machete gleaming in the moonlight. They struck suddenly, like lightning burning warehouses, seizing weapons, freeing those still chained. Some said she moved like a spirit unseen until it was too late. Others swore they heard her praying in Yoruba before each attack, calling upon Ogun, the god of war and iron, to guide her hand. Her defiance echoed beyond the cane fields, beyond the island itself. For every plantation that fell, the empire trembled a little more, but the enemy was vast, and the cost of freedom was rising. The Spanish forces descended with fury. They knew they were not merely suppressing a revolt, they were trying to erase an idea. Soldiers combed through the forests, burning villages, executing anyone suspected of helping the rebels. Carlota's band fought bravely, ambushing patrols, cutting supply lines, striking and vanishing again into the cane. But one night, fate turned against them. A captured fighter, broken by torture, revealed their hiding place. At dawn, the soldiers surrounded the camp. Gunfire shattered the silence of the forest. Carlota fought to the last breath, her body moving like a storm among the trees. She was wounded, captured, bound. The Spanish officers, enraged by her defiance, decided her death must be a spectacle, a warning to every enslaved African who dared to dream. In the central square of Matanzas, before a crowd forced to watch, they tied her wrists to 2 horses. But even in that final moment, Carlota did not bow. Witnesses said her eyes met those of her executioners, calm, steady, unbroken. When the order was given, she did not scream. Her body was torn apart, her spirit was not. Those who watched wept in silence, but in their hearts, something impossible to kill had already begun to live, the certainty that freedom, once seen, could never be forgotten. News of Carlota's death spread faster than the soldiers could silence it. Within hours, whispers turned to wails, quiet mourning that rolled across Matanzas like distant thunder. People who had never seen her spoke her name with reverence. Carlota, they said, the one who died standing. The Spanish tried to make her death a lesson in obedience, but it became the opposite. Among the enslaved, her execution only hardened their resolve. On plantations from Jovellanos to Sabania, workers paused their labor and muttered prayers in Yoruba. The sugar fields, once symbols of submission, began to feel alive with defiance. The uprising itself was crushed, its leaders executed or scattered, but what the soldiers could not kill was the idea Carlota had ignited, that freedom was not granted by masters or decrees, but seized by courage. Even the overseers could feel it, a change in the air, an unease they could not name. In the villages of freed black Cubans, people gathered at night to light small fires in her memory. They sang the old chants, "Ogun, protect us, Carlota, guide us." For them, she was no longer just a woman. She had become something greater, a spirit of resistance that no blade could sever. Cuba's plantations returned to work under the lash, but they were never the same. The planters feared the silence more than the drums. They feared the eyes that no longer looked down when ordered to. Carlota's blood had seeped into the soil, and from it, something was growing. The empire had won the battle, but it had lost the island's soul. After the rebellion, the Spanish authorities moved quickly to erase Carlota from memory. Her name was banned from church records, forbidden in public talk, and omitted from official reports. The uprising was reduced to a footnote, a disturbance among the Negroes. But history, when whispered through the heart of the oppressed, never truly disappears. In Matanzas, women passed her story in lullabies to their children. They would not say her name aloud, but they beat the drums in her rhythm, each strike a pulse of remembrance. Years turned to decades, plantations changed owners, and slavery itself was finally abolished in 1886. Yet even in freedom, the scars of bondage remained. The people of African descent in Cuba, the Lukumi, the Yoruba descendants, carried within them the buried story of the woman who had fought for all of them. In their rituals, they called her Mãe da Liberdade, Mother of Freedom. In their prayers, she was a warrior beside Ogun, her machete shining in the spirit world. Children born in Matanzas were taught that the earth beneath their feet was sacred because it held the blood of a woman who had refused to kneel. Even as the Spanish Empire collapsed, even as new flags were raised, her name still traveled quietly through the drums, waiting for the day when Cuba itself would dare to remember her aloud. For more than a century, Carlota's name lived only in whispers and rhythm. Then, in 1975, Cuba was at war again, not on its own soil, but across the Atlantic, in Africa. The country launched a military mission to aid the people of Angola in their fight against Portuguese colonial rule. The operation needed a name, something that carried weight, defiance, and memory. They called it Operation Carlota. For the first time, in the voice of the nation itself, her name was spoken with pride. Fidel Castro stood before the Cuban people and said, "We fight not only for Angola, but for the memory of the woman whose blood was shed on our own land." Across the island, the old Yoruba drums beat again, not in secret, but in celebration. In the same fields where Carlota once fought and died, soldiers prepared to cross the ocean to defend another African land. History had turned in on itself, forming a circle of justice that stretched across continents. For Cuba, it was not just politics, it was ancestry, redemption, a recognition that the enslaved Africans who built the island's wealth were also the ones who had built its soul. In schools, children learned her story. In Matanzas, her name was carved into marble. For the descendants of the Lukumi, it was as though their grandmother had finally been allowed to speak. Carlota, the woman who had died without a grave, was reborn as a national symbol not of tragedy, but of resistance. The rebellion she led had failed in arms, but it had succeeded in spirit. It had planted an idea that could not die, that even one woman, if she believes deeply enough, can shake an empire. Carlota Lukumi never learned to write her name, yet history wrote it for her in ash, in rhythm, in blood. She had no army, no wealth, no allies in high places. What she had was a will that could not be broken, a belief that freedom was worth dying for, even if she would never live to see it. Empires are built on silence, but Carlota taught Cuba to listen to the drums, to the cries, to the truth buried beneath sugar and chains. She died young, but her defiance outlived every governor, every plantation, every lash that once ruled the island. Today, in Matanzas, a statue stands where she once fought. Her head is lifted high, a machete rests in her hand, sunlight glinting off its blade. Children come to lay flowers at her feet, and when the wind passes through the cane fields, it sounds like the drums of her people. On the stone beneath her figure, there are no grand speeches, only a single line. Carlota Lukumi, the woman who turned pain into freedom. In that silence, her heartbeat continues, a rhythm older than the empire, older than the chains. A rhythm that says, one woman's courage can make the whole world remember.